What if Hitler had suddenly decided that instead of tanks, it would be better to build giant breweries to conquer Europe with intoxicating happiness? Imagine, instead of Blitzkrieg, Bierfestkrieg, and Churchill, cigar in hand, nervously trying to fight off the German camp with a strong British ale. Of course, the story of the Second World War was a little different, but doesn't it seem strange that the fate of an entire continent depended on a few people who, frankly, sometimes behaved as if they were playing chess with their eyes closed? So much for the paradox. The worst war in human history could have turned out very differently because of one random twist, or because of someone's whim at breakfast. I've always enjoyed digging into these what if. Alternative history is not just a game for bored professors in tweed jackets. It's a chance to look at our Europe from a different angle. What could have happened if someone had taken a wrong turn somewhere? Why is this interesting? Because we all live in a world that hangs on by the threads of chance. And by the way, it reminds us that even great leaders are just people who sometimes forget where they put their plans for the day. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, or tea if you're a traditionalist, make yourself comfortable, and let's dive into a story that never happened, but sounds so convincing that you'll be thinking about it for a long time. What if? Ahead of us is a story about Europe, where the Second World War did not go according to the script, and I promise, it will be harder to tear yourself away from it than from your favorite TV series. The topic of the Second World War is not just a set of dates and battles. It is a tangle of human dramas, ambitions, and mistakes. Imagine how one small shift, for example, if Stalin had suddenly decided that he liked writing music more than fighting, or if France had said no to the Munich Agreement and attacked earlier, could have turned everything upside down. The irony is that real historical characters often seem to us either geniuses or caricatures. But in alternative history, we can laugh a little at their decisions without losing respect for what happened. So get ready. We are going to plunge into a world where Europe could have become completely different, but at the same time remain painfully familiar. And believe me, it will be more fun than listening to Churchill argue with de Gaulle about whose accent is cooler. So, let's imagine that in 1938, the Munich Agreement failed not because someone was offended, but because France and Britain suddenly decided, let's not give Hitler the Sudetenland for nothing. Imagine Edouard Daladier, who instead of shaking hands in Munich, slams his fist on the table and says, "No, Adolphe, this time you've gone too far with your appetites." And Neville Chamberlain, instead of his famous umbrella, brings a map with red lines to the negotiations and declares, "Here we stand, and not a step back." What would have happened? Let's take a look. The first thing that changes is that Germany does not get the Sudetenland without a fight. Instead of the peaceful Anschluss of Czechoslovakia in 1939, Hitler is forced to throw his troops onto the well-fortified Czech borders. And the Czechs, by the way, were not so simple. Their army was one of the best equipped in Europe at the time, with tanks that even the Germans could envy. In reality, they surrendered without a fight. But here, imagine a protracted campaign where the Wehrmacht is bogged down in mountains and fortresses. Hitler is enraged. Goebbels comes up with propaganda about the invincible spirit of the Aryans. But in reality, the German war machine begins to stall before Poland. Irony? Absolutely. Imagine Hitler shouting at the generals, "You said it would be a walk, but we haven't been able to take a single castle for a week." Meanwhile, France and Britain, inspired by their no, decide not to just sit behind the Maginot Line and wait, but to go on the offensive. In reality, they waited until 1940. But here, in 1939, French tanks and British aircraft were already buzzing on the Rhine. The Germans, who had not yet managed to establish mass production of panzers, were forced to fight back with what they had. Hitler, of course, tears and slashes, but his brilliant plan is coming apart at the seams. And what does Stalin do? He sits in the Kremlin, rubs his hands together and thinks, well, let the West exhaust itself, and then I'll come to the finished product. In this reality, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is never signed because Stalin sees that Germany is already in trouble. By 1940, the situation for Hitler was becoming like a bad joke. Instead of lightning-fast victories, there was a protracted war on two fronts: Czechoslovakia in the east, France and Britain in the west. Italy, under Mussolini's leadership, of course, promises to help, but as always, arrives late, and with an army that looks more like a parade band than a fighting force. "Benito, where are your tanks?" Hitler shouts over the phone. "Adolf, "The main thing is to look stylish," replies Mussolini, adjusting his hat. It's funny, but in this reality, the Italians will long remain the second number who talks more than they do. And what about Poland? Poland, by the way, is getting a chance. In reality, it was crushed in a month. But here, when Germany was mired in Czechoslovakia, Poland entered into an alliance with France and Britain. Polish cavalrymen, of course, do not rush at tanks with sabers. This is a myth, by the way. But their army, together with the Allies, creates another headache for the Wehrmacht. By 1941, Germany is exhausted. The economy is cracking, the people are grumbling, and Hitler is beginning to suspect that his 1,000 years of the Reich will end a little earlier than he planned. Technology in this reality is also going the other way. Without quick victories, Germany does not have time to develop its Wunderwaffe. Jet aircraft and V-2 missiles appear only in sketches. Instead, Britain and France, having tasted victory, invest in aircraft and tanks. Imagine Spitfires chasing the Luftwaffe over the Rhine, or French balloon B-1s calmly crushing German fortifications. Culture? It's interesting. Without the occupation of France, we don't lose the golden age of Parisian cafes, where Ernest Hemingway wrote his novels instead of hiding from bombs. In Germany, on the contrary, propaganda loses its luster. The people no longer believe in victory around the corner. By 1943, Germany surrenders. Hitler is possibly removed by his own generals, who are tired of his tantrums. Europe breathes a sigh of relief. But what happens next? The Allies win early, but without the American Marshall Plan, because the United States hardly intervenes, recovery is slower. The Soviet Union, without fighting, quietly builds up its forces, but Stalin, as always, is more afraid of his own shadows than of the West. The balance of power in Europe becomes unstable. France and Britain are the leaders. Poland and Czechoslovakia are new players, and Germany is defeated, but not humiliated, as in reality. The irony is that this war, although shorter, leaves more questions than answers. How would we live in such a Europe? And don't you think that sometimes one stubborn no could change everything? So, what do we have in the end? A Europe where World War II ended not in 1945, but in 1943, without millions of victims and destroyed cities. Hitler is probably living out his days somewhere in a Bavarian prison, dictating memoirs about the great injustice, and Churchill and de Gaulle are arguing over who did more to win. Germany does not become ground zero as in reality, but it also does not dictate the fashion for autobahns. France retains its cafes and pride, Poland and Czechoslovakia get a chance to have their own voice, and Stalin, well, he continues to play his paranoid games, but without the Iron Curtain. The world is as fragile as ever, but a little different, and maybe a little more fun. This alternative history makes us wonder, if someone had once said no at the right time, would we be living in a different Europe today? The irony is that the real world often hangs on the same thin threads. One signature, one meeting, one stubborn leader. Maybe we were lucky that everything turned out the way it did, or maybe we just don't know how it could have been better. Imagine yourself in this alternative reality, drinking coffee in Paris where no one has heard of the occupation, or listening to Polish radio boasting of the victory over the Wehrmacht. It sounds good, doesn't it? But on the other hand, without the lessons we learn, wouldn't we have stepped on the same rake later? Let's summarize with a smile. In this story, Hitler lost not because of tanks, but because of Czech fortresses and French stubbornness. Mussolini remained the king of pathos, and Stalin never got his moment in the sun. History is a capricious thing, but understanding its what-ifs is like playing a detective game where you are your own Sherlock. Did you enjoy thinking about such twists and turns? Then, like us, it's a sign that you like our travels to alternative worlds. And subscribe, because there are many more stories ahead that you won't be able to put down. Let's figure out together how history would turn out and what it can tell us about the present.